So, thanks for coming to the Web APIs powering the Starshot trial. Quick raise of hands. I didn't know Dries was going to have the URL in the Dries note. Did you try it yet? Okay, only a few. There will be a QR code, so you can snap it and give it a try. So, what's really unique about the Starshot trial is it's leveraging native and open features for a unique trial experience. Is everybody here familiar with simplytest.me? Yeah, some. Okay, most that lets you try Drupal, but it's backed by Tugboat QA, which is a third-party service. With this, we don't have vendors. Some of the APIs we're going to talk about today are WebAssembly, IndexedDB API, WebWorkers API, and Web Components and how they're used. I really love this because when people think of front-end development, they're like, React, Vue. No, those are third-party libraries that build components. These are how you build applications on the modern web platform. So I'm excited to really show this to you guys today, so that way, hopefully, as you're building other applications, the Starshot trial will be like, hey, I know how I can solve other situations using these tools. But first, let's talk about WebAssembly. PHP in the browser? Raise of hands. Who has heard of WebAssembly before? Wow, all right, cool. Well, this will help break it down a little bit more if you've heard about it but haven't quite understood it yet. So WebAssembly, or WASM for short, defines a portable binary code format. So think of like assembly language, hence why it's called WebAssembly. It's a compilation target for C and C++ and Rust and Go. So any language that's compiled, generally something can compile it to WebAssembly instead of just normal machine code. So PHP, the interpreter, because it's a scripted language, is in C. So that means we can compile the PHP interpreter to WebAssembly and run it in a WebAssembly environment. And all browser JavaScript engines support WebAssembly. Great. One of the really awesome things about WebAssembly is it's not just like Meta came up with it and then turned it into like it became a de facto standard. This was actually built off something from the Mozilla Foundation group. Yeah, it was called like ASM.js, but then was turned into a full new standard via W3C community and working groups. So it's not just something, like it actually has full standards behind it. If you go online, it's like webassembly.org or .dev. So let's take the normal Drupal stack. You've got your browser, and then you've got a server, and that server's got Linux, Apache, PHP, MySQL, or Nginx and Postgres, whatever, you got your stack. And then you got Drupal that's on that server, and that's how people interact with it. Browser hits web server, gets returned server-side rendered HTML made by Drupal. But with WebAssembly, what if your browser was the server? And you had SQLite running inside WebAssembly as well with PHP that just talked to Drupal and then gave you back that server-side rendered HTML. See, JavaScript's not cool. PHP and Drupal have been doing server-side rendered HTML for a long time. WebAssembly removes the need for third-party services. As I brought up before, it is great that Tugboat offers their services for free for simplytest.me, along with Drupal.org and merge request previews, but there's still another company and a third-party service. This is a completely agnostic piece of technology that lets us empower people to try out Drupal and Drupal CMS. So how do WebAssembly and JavaScript mix together? There's this tool. Wait, hold on. Did I get through? Oh, this skips ahead a bit. There is a tool called Emscripten, and that is what takes the C code and then compiles it to WebAssembly. I guess it brought up Rust. Rust just has WebAssembly as a native target for its compilation, but Emscripten is a project that lets you take your C code, make it WebAssembly. And this there's like this method called C call. It took me until I did these slides to realize it's not just CC all, it's C call. So if anybody reads that code, they're like, oh, that makes sense. And what's really cool is it allows you to build SDKs around the WebAssembly and just work with JavaScript. Like I haven't peeked under the hood for the WebAssembly. I just know I compile it because I'm only working with JavaScript in this trial. Emscripten does provide a file system API, which we'll dive into for a bit. So that lets the browser act like the web server by hosting the files. All of Drupal is in your browser in your little site settings. And then we can use a service worker to act like the CGA, the Common Gateway Interface, that says, hey, request, I'm going to ship you off to PHP and give you back the response from there. So I hate putting code in slides, but hopefully with dark mode it works out okay. So with this, phpweb.mjs is a JavaScript module that was created by Emscripten. So not only does it compile C to WebAssembly, but it will generate the JavaScript that lets you invoke the WebAssembly code. We get the new binary, which is an import promise, and we wait for that to return. Then we call phpw_run, which is a C function, and we pass echo hello world. And it's not shown here, but basically that would print us back that logic or the output and render it. This is kind of verbose, but luckily using the PHP WASM library that Sean Morris has provided, we can just use PHP web and say, hey, PHP web, run this code, and all of that's been abstracted a bit, which makes it really easy to run PHP in the browser. So I brought up IndexedDB and how Emscripten provides a file system API. One of them is through IndexedDB. So local storage, a lot of people use the local storage. That's for good little chunks of data. But IndexedDB lets you do structured and blobs of data, which is conveniently great for files. So Drupal is actually stored inside IndexedDB, inside the file system, inside the browser. Emscripten has a file system API for that, or if you're using Node, because you can do this in Node.js, that uses the native disk. So there's that. And another fun thing is to get cookies to work. When I was first building this, you'd be logged in, and about a minute or 5 minutes later, you're just logged out because the cookies were getting lost. So actually the cookies are persisted inside IndexedDB. So when you log into your trial, the cookies are stored there alongside the files as well. So that way the session persists. Little screenshot. So if you were to go into the application, into your dev tools, you can actually see the list of files. And it works pretty much like a native file system. There are some issues around permissions, like how Drupal likes to harden sites default. That kind of breaks the files in IndexedDB a little bit, so we had to turn that off as a little footnote. One of the way that it's really powered, though, is using web workers and the web worker APIs. We leverage two different kind of workers, a dedicated worker and a service worker. There's also another kind of worker called shared workers, but if you go onto the MDN web docs, they can really explain those differences. The service worker one is the really cool part. So think of it as, actually, if you're not familiar with service workers, most progressive web applications, I think everybody's heard of that word now, leverage a service worker, but that lets you handle offline mode, where you could say, oh, every network request, I'm going to cache them, because it can intercept all fetch requests. Well, if it can intercept all fetch requests, that means we could capture requests and say, hey, send it to the PHP code instead, and we'll take that response and send it back to the browser. So that's exactly what it does. So it will process, it'll take that, send it to index.php basically, or any other script file, return that value, and send it back, which is just what PHP FPM basically does with Apache or Nginx. So the service worker is acting like the CGI that will render PHP and serve those requests. One difference, the previous code I showed with PHP Web allows you to run arbitrary code, so you could just like download a random file and execute it. With how the service worker is built, it actually executes the main function, so it's a specific file entry point, like in your doc root. So one caveat there. Then we had to implement a dedicated worker. Andy knows we had a wonderful time debugging this. If you've tried it yet, you'll see there's a little download percentage, or when it's unpacking the archive or installing. For the life of me, it stayed at 0. Waited and went to 100%. That's because WASM was executing on the main thread, so the browser would not paint. It would not repaint any updates. The console.log had everything, and I was like, what is going on here? So by implementing a dedicated worker, it actually runs that code on a separate thread. So this is where if you do have some heavy applications with JavaScript, a dedicated worker has its own memory, and a shared worker allows you to share those things, but we didn't need that here. So that way, when you're unpacking the archive to the system, or it's doing like an automated install, that way we can get feedback or get status updates from the PHP code and render percentage updates as it's being installed. One unfortunate part about the workers is that all of the files they use are isolated, so it ends up downloading the WASM twice, which isn't a problem if you have correct content type headers. I do believe that's something we have to fix with the GitLab pages. Oh yeah, the trial is hosted on GitLab too, so it's part of a GitLab pages setup. I think that might cause duplicate downloads, but if once we tweak that, it would use disk cache in your browser. So there's one caveat when you use workers. If you're sharing scripts, they get downloaded twice. Unless somebody happens to know how to prevent that, they can see me after and educate me. We also use web components. So one of the things is I did not want to implement or add Vue or React.js. I wanted to keep, this is already complicated enough, that I didn't want to add like a whole new like JSX, and also the idea of like all native platforms was great. If you haven't used web components, they're awesome. You should use them. It's extremely flexible. So inside, if you go look at the source code, so if you go to the Drupal CMS repo, there's a subdirectory called trial where you can look at all of this. There's a trial manager element that I created, and it has different attributes, such as the mode. So if the mode is empty, it shows a spinner. Once some logic happens, it changes the mode to be new session or existing one, and all web components have a attribute changed method. So it checks like, did the mode change? And then it re-renders itself with the appropriate action. Start automatically installing or show some actions like, hey, you already have an existing session. Would you like to start it, do a new one? Or what's coming soon is the ability to download and take the code and data with you. So it's a great way to create dynamic interfaces without writing code manually or using jQuery UI like way back in the day, or taking modern rendering channels. Yeah, and also it's kind of neat because it's actually highly coupled to the dedicated worker. So they're like, having coupled code isn't always the best, but the trial manager, instead of executing the logic itself like it used to, delegates everything to the worker and communicates via messages directly. So when you have workers, you can send them messages and they will reply to the parent. But sometimes that falls apart, because what if you have a custom element and then you have your dedicated worker and then you have your service worker, and they all need to correlate and be able to communicate with each other? That's where broadcast channels come in. I honestly didn't know this one existed, and I went to the MDN web docs and looked at the web APIs and just scrolled. I was like, all right, there's got to be something in here for me to go look at. So a broadcast channel is kind of self-explanatory. It lets you dispatch messages and subscribe for them. So if you write Drupal code and you create a logger, and it's like, I have a logger of this name, same concept. It's just anybody can say broadcast channel, this ID, they can post messages or subscribe to them and then react to those. Because when it comes to the service worker, only the main window can easily send messages and subscribe to the service worker. Same with the dedicated worker. Whoever instantiates the worker can subscribe to messages. So this way, when you first load on the page, the service worker says, hey, I'm booted and ready. Well, the trial manager subscribes to that and says, great, now we can check the disk to see if Drupal's already installed, if the files exist, or we should start installing a new one. The install worker, once it finishes everything, tells the CGI worker to do a refresh. That's a bit of a like implementation detail to make sure that the service worker knows that the disk has been updated, so that way it has the correct files. And the broadcast channel created like a great way to provide this communication across all these different components and make a coupled yet decoupled application. Now, if you'd like, here's a QR to go try it out. If you access this on a desktop, you will get the Drupal CMS installer that Mike Herschel helped theme and others, and that lets you pick the recipes. On a mobile phone, since they aren't as powerful, and I'm sorry, anybody with an iPhone, that's not like shade. That's not shade. I'll get to why. The interactive installer was really slow. So if you go on mobile, it installs in the background for you, and then you'll get to your site. And I say, sorry, iPhone, because we did find an issue with the stack size and the WebAssembly runtime, where Drupal loads too many files. And it's like, nah, I quit. I'm not doing this. I have had reports, and this affects Safari on macOS and iPhone. It's a tricky issue. I have been looking into it. And I have had reports of some folks with M1s it working, but I've tried it on M1s and it didn't work. So, but it is one thing to look at. This is still a prototype, so I'm sorry if you get it and it doesn't work on your device. We are finding ways to get it through, as it is still a bit experimental. So I tried to get through that a little quick so we could have about 5 minutes for questions. Now, we might not be able to get to everybody, but if you are curious, you want to chat more and be like, have feedback, or you want to find ways that you could use this yourself, because it is built for people to build their own runtimes as well. I'll be down at the Acquia booth, just at the tables outside of it. Come have a chat, because I know this is kind of like, what? And actually, I would love to know how you did this so I could copy it over and implement it. So the mic should be open if anybody wants to pop up and ask a question while we have some time.
First, that's really cool. And I know that you and others probably had your hands full a lot with this, but like one thing that I've been wondering about is if you looked at any of like the Edge SQLite databases, because you are so close to all of the things being able to live on the Edge, which would be amazing.
Yeah, I forgot to put I wanted to put a gotcha slide in, but it's extremely technical. So right now, HTTP requests do not work inside the WASM the WASM runtime. So we have to implement, and Scripton has a thing called asyncify that would allow us to map it to JavaScript promises. Or it supports WebSockets. And there's a way to set up a WebSocket and pass it to WASM to handle HTTP requests and send us and then do SQLite on the Edge. Possibly, maybe. Okay. That's what I'm going to find out on Friday.
Gotcha. Yeah, that certainly wouldn't work without HTTP requests.
Yes.
So, cool.
And that's one thing, this got started. I first experimented with PHP and WebAssembly last year, same time like Andy did, and it was like, this is neat, but the key of like the service worker or CGI was the missing piece. Put it down. Portland, Dries was like, that launch button. I was like, you know what would be great? It was WebAssembly. So this got started in June, and just time's really sparse. But hopefully,
yeah,
Friday, we're going to solve it all.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just have one question.
Yeah.
Can this installer be used to install other profiles, Drupal profile, for example, Drupal core?
Yes, it could. Okay, I'm going to get dangerous here and try to. Nope. That's not going to work because I can't see anything. Yes, it's built that way. The hardest part is I haven't figured out how to package the code so you could easily run it yourself. All this works is it downloads a zip file, and that's it. So you can I wanted to make an example for Commerce Kickstart, for Drupal Commerce folks, even Open Social. I did this for a private an internal work project, where you just take Drush, do Drush site install with a SQLite database, and then you create the archive with that database inside of it, and you have a pre-installed Drupal site in the browser. It's just making this code packageable so that you could say, I want to set up my own WASM runtime with Drupal, and then port it. And I'm starting to work on some of those docs. They're sparse, they're kind of there, but it is completely possible. And my goal is for this not to just be some fancy Drupal CMS thing, but I want this to unlock innovation. And people say, oh, we have a Drupal build. We will do this. Like, let's say you have your own distro and you have designers that need to work with it, but you don't want to give them a hosting environment and pay for it. Maybe you can do this so your designers and like product owners can review it as well. So yes, that is coming. Yeah.
Thanks.
So I think you answered one of my questions is how to export it and what are you going to do with someone that okay, now I want my project to be real.
Yeah. So my goal was to hopefully hit that for Barcelona, but then the pivot came through with the interactive installer. There's a lot of work was put to the interactive installer, so I was like, all right, instead of export, let's make sure we can work on that, because it didn't. There's actually some bugs in the PHP WASM JavaScript that had to be fixed. Right now, there is an export button that downloads the entire disk. So you get the SQLite database, but that's not really usable because you can't take SQLite and push into MySQL. I started to work on a few options and ideas. So here's option one is Drupal core does have a db dump command that takes this database and dumps it to a PHP code, which is what is used for tests. Doesn't work with SQLite yet. The other idea is inside of there, we would work on that so you could download the database and then use ddev to run it locally and then use ddev's hosting provider integration to push to your hoster. And then we have a trial module that's in there, and there will be a button that says, I want to sign up with a hosting provider. And you would use OAuth to log in, and then it would push the code over APIs like you can like on GitHub. They expose Git as an HTTP API, so we could literally upload the files for you and commit them. I don't know how long that will be. It's all possible. But let's say I would love it in a year if you did the trial and like in the demo, people have asked me, how did you get this site? We can have that shown as a possibility where you have Pantheon, Acquia, etc. Going to GitHub so you can go on Amazy.io, the Lagoon, and have a site exported.
Thanks.
All right, I think we're at time now, right? Or can we go a few more minutes because the next one doesn't start till... Does anybody else have a question? I can let's do like 2 more, maybe, possibly. If not, that's cool too.
By the way, I do want to say that if you do Chrome on an iPhone, it works.
It does?
Yeah.
So, okay, I didn't think that worked because it's Safari under the hood when it's Chrome. Or did they change it? Or is it because we're in Europe and they said, Apple, you can't do that anymore?
I don't know,
Oh, whatever. Cool.
but it's working.
Great. I love surprises. Wait, before we do leave, here, if you want in the app, I'd love some feedback on it. I know 20 minutes is hard to do this, but if you're like, it would have been cool if you covered X, Y, and Z, I'd love to know that. And also the contribution on Friday if you're here and able to make it. Which also, if you want to ask me questions about it, I'll be there too. So thanks so much.